So chapter 9 has to do with, as it says, change and continuity. We're going to be looking at all sorts of new things that come about in the 1920s, and especially their effect on women. You've heard them called the Roaring Twenties. And the thing about the Roaring Twenties is that it looks really good. It looks like, money is just being made everywhere. And, for some people, that's true. But it's not true for most people. Now, what's happening is our prosperity, our roaring of the Roaring Twenties, our boom time, is coming at a price for many people. Okay, don't let it escape you that the period that follows this is the Great Depression. Okay, so it's surface. You have industrial growth, which is making some people wealthy, the people that, the corporations and so on. You've got some new labor saving goods that do help housewives and people, even on farms, you're going to see a lot of those. And then the spread of electricity, which is not going to really, it's not going to spread everywhere. You're not going to expect it pretty much everywhere in in all these little corners of the United States for quite a while after this, but we're starting to see it become more common in some homes. Okay, now the reality is the Roaring Twenties, it looks great, but many Americans are going to live below the poverty level. Okay, and I've seen statistics that will say about half of Americans are going to live just right at the level where they could get their basic needs met: food and water, shelter and clothing. Not good food, great, clothes, great, home, just basic needs. Okay. So farmers, though, they had gone in and put extra mortgages on their farms. Sometimes they were getting in deeper debt. They had, for one thing, they had bought some of these brand new industrial machines that could go out, farm machinery. That's a big thing. And so they were getting deeper in debt as far as that goes already throughout the 1920s. But at some point, the crop prices are going to fall. So you've got farmers that are producing more than they could sell, okay, at some point. And that's going to be the story of a lot of the Great Depression is, you're going to have so many things that have been produced, but not as much demand for those products or crops or whatever. So industrial workers are still working in these really difficult conditions. Even after the Triangle Fire, you don't see as much regulation as you would think within that next decade. It's starting, but it's not really there quite yet. Now, Black Americans are going to still have to deal with segregation for quite a while, poor wages if they hire you. And a lot of places in the South in particular, you don't have a lot of opportunity to get good paying, decent jobs that can sustain your family. So we also have something we talk about called the new economy. 1921 and 22, after the war and after the treaty's been signed and all the things that happened after 1918, by 1920 or 20, 20, and then in 21 and 22, we had, at first, um, we had a little bit of a downturn. And then by 1921 and 22, we're going to have a full-blown recession, which is more than a downturn. It lasts a little bit longer and affects more people, right? So the United States, though, comes back from that. 1923, 24, we're going to start to see all this great prosperity. Now, again, that doesn't mean the regular people like you and me are getting rich, because your economy can be great. The stock market can be fantastic, but your regular people can still be living in poverty. Okay, some people are going to get wealthy no matter what's going on. For example, Joe Kennedy, he's gonna be a guy, John F. Kennedy's father. He's gonna be a guy that gets in Hollywood. He invested a lot of money in Hollywood and other things, like alcohol during Prohibition. But anyway, there's going to be ways to make money. And some people are going to get very wealthy or grow so in their wealth. But of course, when we're talking about the people who are living in poverty being so many Americans at that time, or just at the point of where they've got their basic needs met, you're going to see the people like Joe Kennedy rising up and getting richer and richer, and many, many others. So there's this growth between the rich and the poor. Okay, this growth in inequality, imbalance in wealth versus poverty. Okay, that's the wealth gap, and it's getting big at that time. Now, the 1920s is a time of manufacturing, and manufacturing goes up and up and up more than 60% in the 1920s. This is where they're producing all these goods, and they're not going to be able to sell them pretty soon. By the time of the Great Depression, they're going to have factories full of stuff that the people can't afford to buy, right? So we call it the Roaring Twenties because of the boom period, because of the changing moral and cultural environment, and because it's also a period after that war, the horrible World War One. So why did we end up with this big economic boom in the United States? Well, the debilitation of the European countries, which is where World War One was fought, right? It was fought on the European soil, and you're going to see that their industry is just devastated. So the United States is the only healthy industrial power in the world. We see new technology that is coming about. Remember, late 1800s, we're going to see a lot of this stuff, like the automobile. And then we're going to have Henry Ford have the automated assembly line. You're going to have, just like you had seen back in the mid 1800s, just like with the railroads, you're going to see auto manufacturers purchasing steel, rubber, glass, everything that goes into making automobiles. Again, just like they did during the booming time of the railroad industry. You have all these peripheral products that are going to be boosted. So another thing is auto owners are going to buy gasoline. Oil corporations are going to boom, just like the railroad. And then road construction becomes important. Okay, in the railroad, it was laying tracks. But here, yeah, imagine a world where you don't go out and there's paved streets everywhere, and there's what we're working with here in the 1920s. A lot of places we're working with horse track. I could say this and I could actually erase that, but I won't. I just leave it the way it is. We are working with horse trails, horse and buggy trails a lot of times. So we're going to start building roads. Now, that's the auto industry is going to be giant, and construction is going to be giant. It's going to be the dependence on the automobile industry and the construction industry that is going to be one of the reasons actually for the Great Depression. Okay. So anyway, other new industries that have come about that are benefiting from all the new technology, radio is going to start commercial radio in 1920. Motion pictures, movies have been around since the late 1800s, but in the 1920s, we're still going to have silent movies, but our first talking film is going to be in 1927 called The Jazz Singer. And we have aviation. Of course, we'd had airplanes again for a while, and we're gonna see that starting to become a little bit more profitable and safer a little bit at that point. We're going to have new home appliances that come out. We're going to have electric power, as I mentioned before. So all of that is pushing the United States economy into a boom time. When it comes to the women working, well, I mean, professional women, college educated women by the 1920s, it's not really unusual anymore. You've had a couple generations of educated women at either mixed, male, female, co-ed universities, colleges, or, single sex or single gender um, colleges like, women only or whatever. Now, the women are going to make their way into things like law and medicine. And we've mentioned this in class while we were still in class. It's going to be a little bit slower for women to be accepted in the legal profession because that has to do with the separate spheres and all that stuff, right? So remember, it has to do with um, the women and their nurturing and all of that makes more sense to them at that time. as a culture, that they would be more drawn toward medicine. I think the voice recorder is really tired of me talking into it. But anyway, women in the new era, we're going to have a reference sometimes made to the new woman. And we have a bigger group of women now that are actually getting married and having a career. 25% of working women were married. Okay. Now, the professional opportunities, again, limited by these acceptable female occupations. And we've talked about that ad nauseum in this class over and over. And collectively, they started to call these pink collar jobs. And this is something, pink used to represent, female. You'd put the little baby girls in pink and the boys in blue and whatever. So anyway, it came to be called pink. These came to be called pink collar jobs, and they're basically low paying service occupations. Okay, working in fashion. Now we're not talking about being the big designers and stuff, but working, somehow in the fashion industry as far as that goes in the lower levels of it. Education, especially the younger kids, social work, as we've already talked about, nursing, as we've talked about. Now, secretarial, that's a thing I think we've mentioned this, but the secretaries used to be men, and it would be like an apprenticeship to work for a man, and then you would be taught the business world. And so when women start being allowed into this field, it becomes a dead end job. Okay, you can't really rise up from being a secretary, or as we say usually today, administrative assistant, and work your way up, learning from the boss, and eventually be promoted to be the executive of whatever. So secretarial became dead end at that point, as did some of the other things. Telephone operators are gone now, but back in the 20s it's a big thing. You see in the picture there, you see an old typewriter. You also see a really old phone, way before any of our time, up on the wall up there. So telephone operators, you pick up the phone. You didn't have to dial zero. At some point, you could just pick up a phone and, hey, magically there was someone. Can I help you? Okay. Anyway, technology got rid of that, but these were all low-paying service jobs, and we can call those pink collar jobs at that time. So we do have some changes in the ideas of motherhood during the new era that affect the new woman. So we have over here some of the challenges to that natural inclination to maternity. Do women just know what to do with that baby as soon as the baby's born? Do all women just want babies? All that. Okay. So it becomes known, and experts like John Watson are going to be out there saying, look, sometimes mothers need help from experts. So they try to take away some of the shame that women had felt in earlier generations if they just didn't know exactly how to be a mother. I mean, I have a 12-year-old and I'm not sure I know how to be a mother. I think we all do the best we can and try to give them the best lives and knowledge and especially love that we can. But the idea that sometimes we could use advice used to be shameful. Okay. So it starts to be a little bit less shameful in the 20s. And middle class women are going to see their role change. So there's less emphasis on that instinctual bond between mother and child, which makes some women feel less connected to their children, which is sad. Okay. Now we have over on the right there, we have Margaret Sanger, who is gonna, she comes up quite a bit in certain times of American history. And even every now and then I'll hear her name mentioned in reference to the place that she founded, Planned Parenthood. She was a birth control advocate, birth control pioneer, and set up Planned Parenthood. And again, like I said, that's still in the news in Kentucky and other places today. So you just need to know who she is, kind of what she is known for. And then we've got the flappers. I love the flappers. Flappers are awesome. The flappers now, yeah, there's a whole bunch of different things out there. that try to tell us why they ended up calling them flappers. And I just pick one because there's so many different things out there. Who knows what it really, really, really came down to. Um, but the one I pick is that these little babies, these little girls, young girls that were be either being raised really as maybe I don't know preteens and so on, and maybe even some of the babies, I guess, but that they wore these big bows on their hair that fell onto their head, maybe, and they called those bows flappers. Now, is that true? Maybe. Yeah, there's some evidence for that, but there's evidence for other reasons they were called flappers. I don't know. But then that name's the one that sticks with this generation as they grew into adulthood in the 1920s. Now, what we know about the flappers is, product of the times. You're going to have a more secular view of everything. Religion is on the decline. You're going to have the Scopes trial where they were in Tennessee, they were trying to make it illegal to teach evolution. And we had the whole trial that happened in actually in Pulaski, Tennessee, with John T. Scopes actually being the defendant, and all kinds of things. There was a conflict of cultures that was absolutely everywhere in the United States. And so this secular view of women and secular view of the world is going to be part of that conflict of cultures in the 1920s, because we see a lot of the clash of cultures is going to come from the country, the rural people, and the city, the urban people. Because a lot of times out in the country, in the smaller towns or whatever, they had the idea that city people were immoral and whatever. They were being exposed to so many different things. And this is the 1920s, so it's during Prohibition. Remember that, what was it, the 18th Amendment? Prohibition. We got rid of alcohol. All through the 20s, there's no legal alcohol in the United States. So the rural people associated drinking and drunkenness sometimes with the cities and all kinds of other things going on. So there was the clash in religion, modernist religious views versus the more fundamentalist conservative views, and all of that just really hits a high point here in the 1920s. So women. Now, it had been, especially in the middle and upper classes, it had been a given that you would remain a virgin until you were married. Did that always happen? No. I mean, people are the same as they've always been. But the idea was you definitely didn't sleep around. You had to keep respectability. Okay. And you had to have a good reputation. Well, women start to change here in the 1920s, and they start to smoke, drink, dance, wear seductive clothing, and makeup. Okay. Now, another thing, this around the turn of the century up through the 20s, somewhere in here, was where women in the United States actually started to shave under their arms and shave their legs. Part of that comes from a magazine. There was, I can't remember what magazine it was or who was on the cover, but there was a famous movie star woman on the cover, and you could see where she had shaved under her arms. And so that started that, kind of becoming a trend that we never got rid of, really. Okay. Now, the clothing that they wear, which actually shows their ankles, part of their legs, their knees sometimes, because before this, respectable women certainly didn't show anything above an ankle. Okay, they're going to start showing more. Hairstyle before these women, you generally didn't have the women getting their hair cut short. Women had long hair. My grandmother, who was born in 1903, didn't cut her hair until she was rather old. I'm not sure how old, but she was not a young girl when she cut her hair. She was not a young woman. So I had another little glitch right there. I'm not sure. I guess what I was saying. I mean, I can go back and just say, again, they were smoking, drinking, makeup, seductive clothing, and all that. So anyway, all of this, they started to cut their hair in a bob, and that became that was something that wasn't really looked upon as feminine. And the speech, they had a lot more slang and so on, and the behavior. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And these women, they're going to fit sort of a pattern. And we're going to talk about, is it really liberating the way that they're living their lives as flappers, or is that an illusion? I want you to keep in mind that most fashions and trends come from the upper class, and they come down. By the time they get to us, they're a lot cheaper, right? So you have the fashion in Paris and London, and people go there and they spend thousands of dollars on some clothes and whatever. And then it kind of gets made a little bit more cheaply for us. Okay. So styles usually come down from the top. But in the case of the flapper, this whole lifestyle, the whole image, the whole, just general style they have is going to be really starting among the lower middle class and working class single women. In other words, not the usual way that fashion and trends spread. So what's going on is a lot of these women, remember, are getting out of their families' homes. They're able to have more independence because they're taking jobs in factories and also in service jobs, some of the pink collar jobs that we talked about. Because a lot of them, they don't want to get married, or they don't want to get married early or young. Sometimes they just want independence to go and do what they want to do. Well, these young women are going to change what is sort of acceptable to do. They're going to go out to clubs and dance halls, maybe alone. Okay, that was very new. And you're going out unchaperoned with male companions. Remember, in the middle class and the upper classes, you always had the idea that the young man might come over and sit in the parlor and you would talk, but there would always be someone else around. Or I remember watching old TV shows like The Brady Bunch, and somebody was going on a date and they had to take someone with them, and all those type of things. But it's going to start to make the change in this more free, like, well, we're getting ready to like tear this apart in a minute, but it's going to make the women look as if they're a lot more free in what they're doing, okay, making their own choices and so on. Because notice here that despite the outward image of liberation that they put out there, like you would see the women in the ads and in the movies, and advertising cars, advertising whatever sexy things, cigarettes or whatever, and it would look like, wow, these women are making their own way. They're out there just living the life of independence and whatever. But in reality, most women are going to still be dependent upon men. Okay, if they live at home with their father, their family, that's one form of dependence. If they are married, the husband is going to have control for a very long time. I mean, remember, you can't get a credit card without asking for your husband's permission for a long time. They didn't have credit cards in the 20s, I don't think. Really, I don't think they came about till maybe the 40s, definitely by the 50s. But you couldn't do certain things. In some cases, you couldn't even get a job without your husband's approval. So again, you're kind of powerless if you're married, and if the husband exploits you, and the fact that you actually do depend on him. Sometimes the men would not let their wives learn how to drive, for example. I know a lot of older women that grew up, say, in the 40s and even the 50s sometimes, that I've known over the course of my life. And that, and some of them meeting in this women's history class, some of the older women, their husbands would not let them drive. And they couldn't get a divorce because, man, I've never been allowed to work. I've never had the ability to drive. So that puts you in a really terrible spot, especially if you're living in a really bad marriage and you just feel like you can't escape. Now, if you're in the workplace, you're being paid a lot less than the men. Okay, women and children are going to be paid sometimes as little as half the rate. Depends on the job, depends on where you are, but sometimes as little as half the rate of a man, sometimes a little bit more. Okay, sometimes a little bit more, but never equal pay in the workplace for equal jobs. Pictures of some of the flappers. You can see the hairstyle, the bob cut. You can see them very proudly showing off their calves, and I think a couple of, yeah, they're showing some of their knees and everything. This is all new. Notice they have shoulders too. They're showing their shoulders. None of this the generation before was acceptable. And I always like the little flapper hats. They have a name, but I always forget to look it up. Once again, more of the flappers showing off their fashion style. What about in the political arena? Well, we got the right to vote. Remember, 19th Amendment goes into effect 1920. We've got the right to vote federally. Warren G. Harding gets elected, et cetera, et cetera. So now, okay, that we have the right to vote, we need to get out and vote. So at first, it's pretty cool because they form the League of Women Voters in 1920. Okay, it was formed by some white women who wanted to put an emphasis on teaching women how to make good decisions with their votes, to understand politics, to understand the language of politics, all of that. And they're going to have an emphasis on lobbying, going and actually talking to your senators, representatives, and so on, and voter education, which is what I just mentioned, and the fact that you need to go vote. And I'm saying all of that to all of you right now. You need to go vote. You need to always vote. But please educate yourself about your candidates before you vote, okay? It's being a good steward of your civic duty, because it really is your civic duty to vote. Anyway, we don't take it, we take it for granted. We don't hold it as close as these women who grew up not having that right. And again, it's a different world back then. And sometimes the whole taking things for granted today kind of worries me, because we forget where we've come from sometimes as women, and of just in general, but particularly for this class as women, we forget sometimes. So when you have this idea then that the League of Women Voters is going to emphasize these things we just mentioned, then you're going to see that it's going to have success, but it's going to vary. It's going to vary by where you are. It's going to vary by income. It's going to vary by many different things. Remember, women are not going to be a voting bloc. They're not going to ever stand together and say, we're going to vote for this because this is something that really benefits women. We're just not like that. Now, remember the most, I guess the time that had the highest turnout in voting was actually the period of right after the Civil War up to about the end of the 1800s. Okay, you had an average of say 78% of people, it was men at that time, who were registered to vote would vote, but it's on the decline by the 1920s. So women are kind of following their husbands and their fathers and their brothers' leads. Okay, sometimes they even ask their husbands and fathers and brothers and whoever, ask them who they should vote for. So it's no surprise, as I said, that a lot of times they're not going out, turning out the vote, and they're definitely not sticking to a block where you're going to have women's issues and then all women or even most women voting together. That's not going to happen. So the women's rights movement's fragmented and going in all different kinds of ways. Remember, they've been fragmented many times from the beginning, even. We saw back with the abolitionist and the suffragist. The suffragist, I'm trying to fight to not call them suffragettes, right? That was meant to be an insult. But the suffragist and the abolitionist, remember, they're gonna have the split, and you're gonna have Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell going one way, and all of that we've talked about. So we're not really agreeing on exactly what we want to happen now that we've got the right to vote. So other things that divide us, besides just being women, are going to take precedence. Okay, just like with men. Okay, class, if you're middle class, upper class, you're going to vote for your interest. If you're black, if you're white, if you're, age, and so all of that, just like the men, just like today. Okay, we still don't have a voting block of women because there's so many other things that usually will take precedent over that. I mean, you never hear people talk about men as a voting block because, that just sounds ridiculous, right? Because it is. Women voters are going to split in all directions as we should, just like men had always done. Okay. And part of it's because the movement has no clear leader or group. Some of the groups that had been around in the late 1800s, mid 1800s, late 1800s, some of those groups have gone away, and some of the people have passed away by this time. So really, they don't have anything that they can rally around as, this is our goal. Because remember, for so long, the women's movement had been focusing on the right to vote. Now we've got it. So again, that's a big deal and a big difference. For all of the booming and roaring that the 20s are doing, 20s is actually a really conservative decade in general, especially in national politics, because people are scared of a lot of change, great change, right? Things like the progressive era that had come right before that. The progressives had tried to push a lot of change, and they had been successful in many ways. Remember the whole progressive era, look back at that when you're studying, and you got to say, made some choices that really helped the country in a lot of ways. But people start to be scared of too much change and want to slow down because they feel like the progressive changes had happened too quickly. So, one thing that happens during the 20s is we start to see a lot of Americans, a lot more Americans, becoming concerned with the size of government. Okay. And big government is something that we have today. It's enormous government that we have today, of course. But after Prohibition is over, when it ends, in the early 30s, you're going to see that Americans are going to be concerned and express their concerns about the government making too many laws. The government is regulating too many things. Now, I am very quick to say we need regulations. We absolutely need regulations. With regulations, you would have had maybe the Triangle Factory fire happening, but probably not something we're still talking about 108 years later or whatever. It would have had, if they'd had regulations, they would have had all these changes that would have made the workplace safe. Okay. So without regulations, you've got nothing protecting you. So of course we do need government for regulations. Some people, though, don't want any authority, as we know. And so we have a lot of people that start breaking what they called, these ill-conceived laws. In other words, hey, they're going to go back and say, well, early American writers said things like, if you don't have control of your government, if your government is doing things you don't want them to do, then it's your duty to overthrow the government. And they didn't necessarily want to do that, but a lot of them sure did enjoy breaking these laws. Now, Prohibition again goes all through the 20s. So we have a lot of people bootlegging. You have like Al Capone bootlegging. Okay, again, another guy that's making a ton of money during Prohibition, selling illegal alcohol. You're going to have people making their own alcohol at home because they think that the Prohibition law, the whole idea of Prohibition, some people think it was just ridiculous. Now, once Prohibition ends, you're going to hear people call it the noble experiment. Okay. But anyway, after Prohibition, you're going to start to see a lot of people actually breaking laws they think should not have ever been written. And today, I mean, we see today as I'm speaking here in April of 2020, the whole pandemic, the coronavirus, the COVID-19 pandemic is still going on to some extent. And you have a lot of people that are out there protesting and protesting and protesting because they don't want to stay at home. And they're talking about the government is keeping them at home and the government is trying to keep them under control because blah, blah, blah. And you hear conspiracy theories abound. Okay. So somewhere in the truth, yeah, or somewhere in the truth, somewhere in the middle, there's truth in here. And it's not going to be found with the conspiracy theorist, and it's not going to be found with these people who just say, well, we can just break the laws because we don't like them. Okay, because it's a lot more complicated than that if you actually read the documents that talk about it's your duty to overthrow an unjust government. For that matter, it went further back in history than the American Revolution was brought up in different places and different times. But the whole idea of the right to revolt or to overthrow your government is based on the fact that if your government is going against your common, meaning the people, your interest, and threatens the safety of the people without due cause, then you should overthrow them. We use that in the American Revolution to some extent, and you're going to see it used in the French Revolution. And, as I said much earlier, you're going to see it in different countries and different places. Okay. And you're going to have one of the great theologians of the Catholic Church, Thomas Aquinas, is going to write in his seminal work called the Summa Theologica. He says that people have the right to resist tyrannical rule. So again, sometimes I think they were, when they're bringing those things up with prohibition, I mean, is that really something that you'd want to overthrow the government about? Or I don't know. That's a good discussion that would be really interesting to hear some people have. Generally speaking, we have a scapegoat just about any time that you look at the United States, or really a lot of places, you'll see this happening. You have a group that's the scapegoat. So we had the anarchists in the late 1800s. We had the anarchists, in some of the things that happened in the 1920s. You see a little bit about the anarchists. And that kind of overlaps with the communist as the scapegoat that everybody's afraid of at the time. So what had happened was the Russian Revolution had come about 1917, 1918, and we end up with communism taking over Russia. We end up with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the USSR. And you see that the idea of communism has become real because we see a big country, Russia, being taken down by a communist revolution. Okay, Karl Marx wanted communism to spread. The proletariat, the workers are going to overthrow the capitalists, the owners, and they're going to actually make a society with no social classes. Everyone's going to be equal. Okay, so the United States formed the Communist Party. There were people that formed this party, and we react with what's called the Red Scare. Okay, now the Red Scare here, and it's really funny because if you look into it enough, you'll see that the 1920s and the 1950s are just mirrors of each other. They're so similar. You're going to have another Red Scare in the 50s, and there's so many other things that I could mention about the 50s and the 20s that I won't for lack of time. But we have the Communist Party, and we also have, just like in the 1920s, we have it in the 50s, we have the owners and the managers and so on trying to keep the unions from either forming or from gaining power. Okay, so suppression of the labor movement. Now we also see at this time, because it's right toward the end of the biggest immigration that we've ever had into our country. 25 to 27 million people were coming into the United States from all kinds of places. a lot of them were coming from places like Poland, some of the Slavic countries, Italy, places that were different. And a lot of them, had earlier immigrants had come, if you recall, from places like England and France and so on. But we're going to start to see people who are more uneducated. A lot of them are peasants. And so we see this resurgence of the KKK. Okay. Thought we were done with those guys. Well, no, they're still around to this day, the year 2020. But in the 1920s, we're going to have them coming, again, back with a vengeance, because in that case, their anger was directed not toward just African Americans, but to immigrants. And they used the same kind of tactics, the terror tactics. Now, women are going to be targeted in the Red Scare, as they also are in the 1950s, by the way. But you have something called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, okay, which sounds like a really nice name for a group. And not only that, I mean, you had Jane Addams of Hull House fame as one of the founders. It was founded around 1915, 1916. And to best of my knowledge, it's still around today. Now, Jane Addams and some of the others that were founders, they're going to get kind of a revitalization of it after World War One. Okay, and their idea is to make sure that there will be peace in the world, obviously, right? I mean, that's right there within the name. But again, they're going to be called out as a communist group. And in the 1920s, again, everybody is going to be called out as a communist group if they've made any sort of waves, I guess. So anyway, that's one thing. I mean, there was some proof that there were communists who were members of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. However, just because there were communists as members of the larger group doesn't mean the entire group had a communist agenda. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Now that's the end of part 1 for chapter 9, and then I'm going to, as soon as possible, going to have part 2 posted. And as I said, it takes so long to post these things, and I'm so sorry, because I'm going as fast as I can creating them, and there's a lot of slideshows, and there's a lot of things that I want to get up as quickly as possible. But sometimes the technology, remember, has been a little bit slow. So this is the latest one right here. And look for part 2 of chapter, what is that, chapter 9? Yeah, look for part 2 soon.